Hello YouTube. Hello YouTube indeed, and welcome to this week's video. Today I want to take some time to talk to you about my favourite brand of paints, Reaper Master Series. Now these are a paint that I absolutely love, and for a number of reasons that I think are quite unique to the brand. Reaper are an American-based company who make both miniatures and paints. And before we get into this video, I should point out, I do have a sponsorship agreement with Reaper. So everything that you see me use in this video was sent to me free of charge, and I think it is important to be transparent with you about that. However, I hope you will understand that that doesn't influence why I'm giving these opinions on the product. In fact, the very reason why I have a sponsorship agreement with Reaper in the first place is because I love and am so enthusiastic about their products. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about Reaper's paints mostly, and we're going to go through a little talk through where I demonstrate painting a miniature from start to finish with their paints, and hopefully that's going to give you a bit of an idea about why I'm so enthusiastic about these paints and why they are my main chosen brand over a lot of other more famous brands. I hope that's going to help explain. First of all, we are going to just go over to a quick bit of down cam footage where we talk about the properties of the paints, and then we'll get into some miniature painting. So first of all, I want to talk about the differences just in the basic properties of these two paints. So I've picked two that are fairly close together. This is going to allow me to kind of make the most direct comparison for all intents and purposes. The first thing I want to show you is related to Reaper paints, and it's something that you would be quite likely to consider a con. And that is that sometimes if you forget to shake Reaper paints, you can see that you're going to get a big old blob of medium just come out of the bottle, and this is just a clear gel medium with very little pigment in it. Now the reason for this is because Reaper use a very heavy grade of pigment, which helps it give coverage without needing to be built up too much. And what that means is that because that pigment is heavy, because those particles are heavy, it can sink to the bottom of the bottle. So for comparison, a Games Workshop layer paint or a Citadel layer paint straight out of the pot, as you can see, gives us pure clean paint. We have no problem there. This is Storm Vermin Fur, and we've got exactly what we wanted, just nice clear paint straight out of the pot. So with Reaper, one thing that's very, very important to know is that you have to shake them very, very well before each use. That is really, really important, and it's just to do with the difference in the makeup of the paint. GW paints are designed specifically to not split as a function of being user-friendly. Reaper paints are a bit more of a, I don't like to necessarily use the word advanced, but they are, they are designed for a bit more of an experienced painter, I feel, or they are designed in such a way that more benefits an experienced painter. So those of us that habitually shake our bottles anyway aren't going to have a problem, but those of us that have a habit of forgetting to do so may struggle a little bit. But as you can see, once we get the paint out onto the palette, the next thing that we notice, if we look at just doing the drag through the GW paint, we can see that that's its sort of thickness. It is quite a thick pasty paint, whereas the Reaper paint will go for miles. It's a lot thinner straight out of the bottle as well. So the idea here is that most hobby paint brands try to create a paint recipe that allows them to balance both the viscosity of the paint with coverage. You typically, for most hobby paints, you want a semi-transparent. So you want a paint that can be thinned down and allowed to layer up transparently so that you can, for example, create blend effects like on this sword. But at the same time, you don't want a paint that is so transparent that it can never cover, because that's getting more into the territory of what we use things like inks for. So that's kind of a different product. So in this case, Reaper comes out of the bottle thinner, and it does require some solid shaking first. But I'm going to move these out of the way. Oh, that's an unpleasant noise. And I'm going to bring in these two 25mm standard bases. And what I'm going to do next is just paint half of this one with a couple of very quick coats of Reaper paint. And you can see the coverage over black is pretty good. I mean, this is, this is coat 1, and we're pretty well covered here already. And then at the same time as I do that, I'm also going to paint one of these bases with Citadel paint. You can see the coverage is a touch higher on the Citadel paint. Here we are. So the first question you're probably going to be asking is, okay, so why would I want a paint that is lower coverage? And the answer is it really depends on what you're trying to achieve with your painting. Reaper paints are not by any measure low coverage. They are lower coverage than GW paints, which are extremely high coverage. So when you work with a paint like this, you have an opportunity to layer up more, to focus on using the transparency of the paint to create effects that rely on layering. I'm just going to skip forward a second now until these are dry so that we can talk about the next thing. I'll be right back with you. Okay, so now that we're back, you can see what I was talking about with the two paints having different sort of properties in their finish. You can see that this one on my left, the Reaper one, is extremely flat. It's not really reflecting any light, and you can tell because comparatively to the bare plastic next to it, the bare plastic obviously is reflecting a fair bit of light, and we're getting basically nothing off the Reaper one. When we switch to the GW one, you can see that because it's a satin paint, we are getting some reflection. And so this is where the big difference with Reaper comes in, because with a satin paint, as you layer up more and more and more of it, you head towards a glossier overall sort of finish. For example, this is a miniature that's painted entirely with Games Workshop paints, and you can see that every surface reflects quite a lot of light naturally. Just the ambient light in my room, the painting lights that I use, you can see they're being reflected off of the surface of the armor. And that is because of that satin property of that GW paint. Now, conversely, a miniature like the one that we're going to paint in today's video, that's painted mostly in Reaper paint, won't do that. So what that allows us to do is a couple of things. It allows us to see more of what we're painting and therefore react more to what we're painting. It also allows us to be able to build in texture manually. So if we want to place reflections or create a texture of wear and tear, or a texture of fabric or cloth or something of the like, having a matte paint gives us a lot more power to control that. It allows us to be in a much better position to be able to dictate exactly how much of those effects are present. So I want to try and sort of arm you with that knowledge that the difference between matte and satin paints is not entirely based on preference. It's very easy to assume that it is just a matter of preference, and that ultimately the difference between these two things is which one you like more. And to a strong degree that is true, but we also have to bear in mind that those different properties do enable different things when we're painting. Alright, so now that we've had a quick natter about some of the properties of that paint and why it might be different to what you're used to using for hobby, we can get on with painting a miniature with it now. And I do think this is the best way to explain why you prefer a paint, is to show it in action, show the different things that it can do. So we've got this really cool little Valkyrie Shield Maiden kind of miniature from Reaper. And I did think that it would be cool to use Reaper paints on a Reaper miniature for this. We're going to get down to the down cam, we're going to paint through that, we're going to have a talk about it, I'm going to discuss the techniques that I'm using, so there will still be a tutorial element to it. And then on the other side, we can wrap up with a little conclusion and see what you think, see if you like Reaper paints as much as I do. Let's get to down cam. Okay, let's make a start with Muddy Brown, Marine Teal and Dragon White. These are the main colours that I'm going to be using for the chainmail. They will appear later as well. First of all, I'm just dry brushing the chainmail with that brown. Hitting the top of the helmet as well, because I want that to be worn metal. Then stepping up to a mixture of the brown and the teal to start to blend some of that dry brush in. Then the teal on its own. Eventually starting to add some of that bone colour into the teal. Just continuing to build up highlights towards raised areas, areas where the light should be catching. And then just switching to, this is less of a dry brush now. It's a quite dryly loaded brush, but not an actual dry brush. As we get onto the sort of final stages of highlight. Now just some pure paint, just to pick out some reflective little bits. Very simple and straightforward. You can see where I've chosen to have the highlights hit there. Now into the three colours that I've put together for Flesh: Suntan Flesh, Warrior Flesh, Graveyard Bone. Reaper encourage you to paint in triads, and a lot of their triads, a lot of their paints you can buy in pre-arranged triads. I tend to make my own based on the desired effect that I'm going for, but the basic principle is that you take three colours that work together as a shade, a base and a highlight. You paint in with the shadow colour first, and then the mid-tone, and then the highlight. When it comes to painting skin, I like to use ink to get a little bit of extra depth, which we're going to do at a later point. So for my base tone, for my darkest colour on the skin, I've actually not chosen something too dark here, which is why I went for the tan flesh. You can see at the moment I'm just blocking in all of the skin, a couple of coats of that tan flesh until I get nice solid coverage with it. Now that I've got a good solid base down for my skin, I can start to build some nice smooth highlights on top of it. So that's how that looks after we've just got a few nice even solid coats. We're now switching over to red ink and brown ink. I'm going to mix these roughly 50-50, and I'm going to thin them quite a lot. Inks do also dry with a bit of a glossy sheen to them, so as I apply this all over the flesh tone, I'm also going to get just a little bit more, it's going to lean a bit more towards satin at first, and then as I lay my highlights over the top, they'll be matte. That sort of gives you that realistic kind of supple, alive feel to your skin, so I do recommend shading it with inks. Pulling away any pooling with a dry brush, and a good old coat of ink gets you to there. From which you can then start to blend in some highlights. Now I'm using push glazing here. The basic principle behind this is that you decide where you want the lightest part of the blend to be and where you want the most transparent part of the blend to be. You lay the brush on the miniature at the part where you want the blend to be transparent, and you push it evenly towards the part where you want the paint to be most built up. You do this with very thin transparent paint, and after you've built up a number of successive layers, you end up with nice smooth blends. You'll start to see them forming first of all on the knees and the thighs, because those are the easiest shapes to get those blends to form neatly on. But as we go forward, you will see them start to come out on the arms and in the face as well. And we're just continuing to lighten our colour. So we start off with the middle of the three colours that we picked, and then we just slowly start adding more and more highlight tone to it as we continue to glaze up layer after layer after layer, and we push more and more towards the brightest points. Eventually we just start to pick out some peak highlight areas with a really, really bright colour, and that gets us a nice smooth, glowing, alive looking skin tone. You can see that I am doing what's called volumetric lighting here, so I have decided that the light source is above, and I'm lighting each volume as if it's being hit by light from above. Eventually, once we get all the way up to just our pure bone colour, we're now just picking out very tiny little highlights, really, really small areas in that pure bone. And after all of that hard work, we end up with a really nice, even, blended skin tone, which I think you'll agree looks beautiful. Speaking of Reaper's Triads, we're now going to go into their non-metallic metal gold Triad, Shadow, Base and Highlight. We're not actually going to use this for NMM Gold straight away, it will reappear later, but what we're actually doing initially is using the mid-tone to paint in the blonde hair. So we're just going to get a nice even coat all over. We want a really sort of golden straw blonde kind of hair for this. I wanted it to look very natural. So with that in mind, the non-metallic metal Triad already seemed to work for that purpose and didn't really need any adjusting. That we've got a good even coat all over that hair, you can see that that's set up now for our next stage, ready to start looking lovely and blonde. And that next stage is going to be to grab some brown ink. This is the same brown ink we used earlier, but it's a lot less diluted this time, and we're going to shade all of that lovely blonde hair. So we now get this sort of yellow-brown undertone, which is going to be perfect when we start to build highlights on top of it to get something that looks blonde. Initially, with that gold highlight colour, we'll just sort of semi-dry brush, just picking up the raised detail, basically. This is just our first pass to sort of establish where light is living in the hair. We're then going to come in and we're going to refine that by using brown ink anywhere that things overspill, using finer strokes with progressively brighter colours. I'm taking that NMM highlight colour and I'm actually adding little bits of the bone colour into it here and there so that I can build up nice bright highlights where I want them. With that range of yellows, browns and sort of ivory bony kind of colours, that gives you that good convincing kind of straw blonde. See, again, just refining there with a few fine strokes. And we've got some nice, lovely looking straw blonde hair with a good highlight across the middle of it. Just going to quickly dot in some eyes now. Just a quick tip on eyes. Don't paint pupils when you paint miniatures this small. Pupils to scale would be invisible. I'm going to chuck in some brown now on all of the areas that are going to be leather. A couple of coats of, this is muddy brown that I'm using. It tends to always be my base brown for some reason. It's just the one out of the Reaper range that I most enjoy using. It covers really, really nicely. It's very flat, it's very smooth. It's really easy to get a good solid base coat on any leather areas before you then start to texture them up. Just hit in anything that's wood or leather with a good even coat of this brown. Nice and simple, up the boots. Handy there because the straps can be painted in this leather colour and the fur that's around the straps can be based in this colour and then highlighted up. A couple of second coats needed here and there, just a few of the larger areas that maybe don't cover so evenly in one pass. Now I'm going to take that woodland brown and I'm going to start progressively mixing more and more sunrise orange in it to build up highlights. For the majority of these leather areas, and even for the wood as well, I'm thinking about texture as well as light. So I'm using small, jagged, textural, angular strokes headed towards the raised areas to make things look worn, to make things look battle damaged. When it comes to the wood grain, I'm going to use a mixture of the orange and the white so that I get a different colour profile to the leather parts, but essentially the same thing, thinking very texturally as I place my highlights in. You can see as I add more and more orange to that, I start to get this impression that the raised parts of the leather are more worn than the parts that are in the depressions. You can also use this colour to start off the fur on the boots. Very straightforward to do so. And again, as we start to add bone or white into this when we highlight the shield, we'll also add bone or white into it to highlight the fur, so that we get the same base brown but different top ends on it to create different effects. Trying to keep more orangey tones towards the woods and the furs. Paler tones towards the woods and the furs, and then more orangey tones towards the leathers. Some fine highlights for the fur. It's looking nice. We're happy. I'm going to grab a quick black glaze now. Again, this is just black paint thinned down, and we're just going to use it to knock back some of those leather areas to create a bit of shadow in them. We'll also run it all over the shield once we've put the first couple of layers of texture down. So we'll just lay down some sort of mapping texture initially, and then we'll fire a black glaze all the way over that before we then come back and start to do some more highlighting. So there's that initial texture placed on the shield. Then there's the black wash all over it. Once that's dry, we can then start to build up those highlights on top of it. So we've got a good foundation underneath. And this is what Reaper paints are all about for me, is layering things over each other, layers of nuance, layers of interplay between colours, underpainting and overpainting. That to me gives you something that's really interesting to look at. And so that's how I like to use these paints. And I think they're very good for that kind of painting. Now we're back to the non-metallic gold Triad. This time we're actually going to use it to paint non-metallic gold. So essentially, all but the very deepest shadows get hit with the shadow tone. So we do leave a couple of black shadows here and there, and that's for definition. But basically every other surface gets hit with the shadow tone. And then we start to mix through and highlight up using the mid-tone and the highlight tone. And the idea being that you just kind of make decisions on where you want reflections to live, and you go for it. NMM is one of those processes that people find very daunting, very scary, and actually the best way to get good at it is to just kind of attack it and paint what you think it should look like, and if it doesn't look good at the end, there's always next time. I mean, if you really hate it, you can paint it back out and start again. That's the beauty of paint. It is not indelible. We can rework it if we're not happy with it. So I'm just making some pretty arbitrary decisions on where I think shiny spots should live, and I'm blending up through the mid-tone into the highlight, just progressively adding layer after layer after layer, shrinking those highlights as they get brighter, so that every time they get brighter, they also get more pinpoint, and that eventually leads us to something that looks quite reflective. See, we're already in a very pale colour here, and we're still not done. We will still keep getting lighter than that. Really start to pick out some fine points. And still brighter. And I think we eventually go all the way up to actually, I think we grab some bone, just making a little correction here first before I finish this section up. But I'm pretty sure that we go, yeah, it looks like we've got some bone here, just to put some little pinpoint reflections on. And then a couple more. Just find those areas where you really want it to sparkle, where you really want the light reflection to be most intense. Just these little dots of white here and there will create that effect for you. And then that's our gold non-metallic, looking pretty good. I'm happy with that gold non-metallic, especially for how tiny the areas are on this miniature that need gold. Some of them are really minuscule, like those buckles, for example. We're going to grab Marine Teal and Graveyard Bone now. We're going to start to work on this shield. First of all, I'm just going to race through and we're just going to get a very, very quick, good, solid base coat of the Graveyard Bone. Basically going to just paint this on, hit it with a hairdryer to dry it off, paint another layer on, hit it with the hairdryer, and the footage is very sped up, so you're not really going to be able to appreciate what I'm doing, but basically just getting the whole thing as solid and as bone as possible. Then I'll grab that Marine Teal and just quarter the shield off. Trying to keep my brush at a pretty solid 90-degree angle to the surface of the shield when I'm painting those straight lines to keep them nice and sharp. Initially, even though we're going to go in and rough them up, I do want them sharp to start out with. And then once we've got nice even coverage there, we can now start to chip into some of that paint and make things look worn. So initially I'm going to decide that the white paint is the first layer and the teal paint was painted on top of that. So there are going to be some areas where the scratches go all the way through, which is where you see me painting black now, and some areas where the scratches just go through the teal paint, and so they reveal the white paint underneath it. You just see me mapping out this battle damage now. She's been through the wars with this shield. Then we apply some highlights underneath that battle damage, white for the white areas and just white mixed with the teal for the other areas. Quick bit of brown into some of those deeper scratches as well, where the wood itself has been exposed, where all the paint has been removed. You end up with a nice battle damage looking shield. Our final big step to completing this is the non-metallic sort of steely colours on the areas that we haven't already tackled. The reason I'm doing the blade, the shield boss and the shield riveted straps all separately is just because they're smoother steel volumes. So the same sort of dry brush method that works for the helmet and the chainmail won't really work here. But I'm basically treating this the same way as I was treating the gold. I'm starting off with that Marine Teal, initially mixed in with a bit of black, eventually starting to go to pure Marine Teal, and then eventually to pure Marine Teal mixed with the bone colours, and we're just getting brighter and brighter and brighter in the direction of where we decide highlights want to live. On the sword itself, because I want the sword to look used, I want it to look like it's been in the wars so it matches that shield. As I start to get brighter, I'm also going to start to integrate just the odd textural strokes here and there, little flicks across the edge of the blade. And what that does is just makes that blade look like it's had a little nicks taken out of it here and there by being used. It makes it just look a bit more like it's actually been in war. We do take the blade all the way up to almost white. And there are actually a couple of reflections that are almost white on the rest of the steel as well, but we go particularly bright on the blade, and that's because we want it to look like a nice, shiny, maintained sword, the weapon that belongs to an experienced warrior. There you see I'm starting to flick in those little bits of damage now. Make that metal look nice and worn. These are just a few little glazes of black just to calm things down. A few fine little highlights to adjust back up. That sort of fine-tuning process at the end I do think is very important. And there she is. That's the NMM done as well. So I've got the base to do now. I'm giving you a quick zoom of that sword here to show off that texture painting that I talked about. When it comes to the base, obviously it depends on what you're going to use the miniature for. I just decided to chuck some colour on it just to make it look complete because I don't have a planned use for this miniature. But I know that you like the spinny reveal videos, so let's do the spinny reveal video now. There we go, that's our completed piece. And all of this, I should point out, is about 3 to 3.5 hours work. The longest sections are the gold NMM and the steel NMM, both of which were about 20 minutes each. Everything else is relatively fast, and you would class this as a speed paint. So the other thing that I wanted to illustrate here is just how well these paints lend to getting good quality results without having to spend ages working on them. And that is also the thing that I really love about them. I do not have the attention span to put 10, 12, 16 hours into a lot of paint jobs. It's very rare that I can do that. So having tools that allow me to work quickly and effectively and efficiently and produce results like this are brilliant for me, and I absolutely love them. So we got a great mini there, and I'm really happy with how she looks. I think it's great to be able to show how those semi-transparent and super matte properties of Reaper really help with things like smooth skin tones, non-metallic metal, especially something like chainmail, which can be daunting to paint in NMM. Ultimately, the reason I fell in love with these paints is because the artists who influenced me, people like Boris Vallejo, Simon Bisley, John Blanche, all paint in a style that blends realism with a sort of grungy, punchy aesthetic. And these paints have helped me to achieve that style in my miniature painting. That really is what it's all about. Falling in love with a particular material in the hobby is about realizing you're happier, more motivated, and more inspired when you work with it. And that's exactly why I encourage you to expand your horizons and try new materials in these videos, often reaching into things that people are maybe a little bit daunted by at first. For me, Reaper paints make me excited to paint certain textures and certain styles, things that previously I may have been scared of, because the behavior of those paints makes those things feel more natural to me. It makes those applications seem a lot simpler. I hope that after watching this, you'll reach out into the wider world of the hobby, look at some new things, try some new things, take a chance on something, and perhaps as a result, feel more inspired and motivated by your painting as a result of that. And hopefully that can bring some happiness. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you in the next one. I'm so bad at YouTube. I was also supposed to announce during this video that I'm going to be hosting a painting competition with a bunch of Reaper Miniatures prizes. That's going to be taking place over on my Twitter, and I was supposed to remind you that there'll be a link in the description to my Twitter profile where you can go and follow me and look out for the announcement so that you can be in with a chance to win a whole bunch of Reaper goodies. Now, I don't want to just understate here, but this is the box full of Reaper goodies that I have to give away. There's a lot of it. I'm such a bad YouTuber. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, folks. We'll be doing a big Reaper giveaway soon that's going to involve a competition.